So from a Buddhist point of view, a central core teaching of the Buddha was conditionality, or condition co-production, paticca samuppada. So our actions have consequences. Some of our actions lead to more liberated states of mind and states of being, our actions of body, speech and mind. And some of our actions lead to more restricted states of being or suffering. And from one way I like to see from a Buddhist point of view is that we can gradually cultivate the clear seeingness of kindly attention to be able to chart a course away from actions of body, speech and mind that lead to restriction and suffering, and to open to, learn and deepen into actions of body, speech and mind that, due to the laws of conditionality, more lead to states of mental, emotional freedom. Now, a really central thing in being human that conditions our thought and motions is the functioning of what science calls the autonomic nervous system. So being autonomic, it happens without conscious thought or control. It's involuntary. And, you know, we have all these aspects of our human functioning that is regulated and governed by our autonomic nervous system. So as I'm speaking now, I'm not actually controlling the size of my pupils for this light. There's a system that's monitoring that and adjusting it. So I've got optimal vision. I've just had roast potatoes and roast veg. And there's a certain process by which bile is secreted from the liver, and there's a certain pace with which digestion happens, for example. None of that I can control. I can't make it quicker, I can't make it slower through an act of will. So there's one particular part of the autonomic system that I wanted to focus on tonight, and that's sometimes called the threat system. So many of you might be familiar with this, and the threat system is a name that's often given to that part of our autonomic nervous system that has been developed over like literally tens of thousands of years. It has its roots back, tracing back way before kind of, you know, Homo sapiens and so to reptiles and so. So the threat system aspect of the autonomic nervous system, as many of you will be aware of, oversees the functioning of the fight, flight and freeze responses to threat. And what I want to do in this presentation really is to just go through the basics of the threat system and outline some of the basic ways in which it heavily conditions or influences our thoughts and emotions. So a starting point is in this capacity that we have for what science calls neuroception. And these are neural circuits that distinguish whether a situation or people are safe, dangerous or life-threatening. So it's quite amazing really. It's like in every moment we've got these neural circuits that are literally scanning for the level of threat autonomically. And as I said earlier, this threat system has its roots thousands and thousands of years ago. So it's actually the main apparatus of it are right in the core of our brain, at the brain stem here, in the reptilian brain. And then more modern, more recent parts of the brain are kind of built around that. Like there's the limbic system, a lot to do with emotion and bonding, mammalian. And then there's the prefrontal cortex, which which comes later, with sort of higher functioning of kind of memory and reasoning and the ability to give perspective and many other functions. But at the core is this threat system, that was designed in the time of predators, which needed to be quick, strong, in maximizing the chances for survival through either fight, running away, or through playing dead or freezing. So we've got this scanning kind of going on, this neuroception kind of going on, and if the neuroception is well functioning, then if it senses a reasonable level of safety, then the body is likely to go into what is often called a regulated state. So this is a state in which relaxation, say, and enjoyment are kind of possible. The brain, all the aspects of the brain are online. Empathy is reasonably accessible, being connected and empathizing with somebody else as well as ourselves. It's conducive to present moment awareness, so that often doesn't feel too difficult. We're aware of our sense impressions as they arise and pass. The muscles are relatively relaxed, and there can be easily an openness and curiosity, which is a natural state of the mind when it's unthreatened. So we're interested in other people, we're interested in things around us, and so on. And from a Buddhist meditation point of view, it's conducive towards, or even necessary as a basis for moving towards meditative states of absorption and the dhyanas. So that's when the nervous system is unthreatened, or there's a perceived and felt sense of safety. Now, obviously, that isn't always the case. So we have an amygdala in the brain that's like an alarm bell. So if the neuroception senses a danger or threat, and this is a key point, is that the danger or threat can come internally. So it could be the arising of a frightening thought, or the arising of an emotion that we feel might be threatening, or the threat can be externally. So if there was suddenly a loud crash outside, for example, that the system will perceive that external stimulus as threat. So when threat is perceived by the system, the threat system can come online, and it brings about, depending on the degree of threat it perceives, it brings about all kinds of physiological changes to the body that then very heavily condition our thoughts and emotions. And I've got a small slide here to hopefully show you this. So hopefully now on the screen you can see the graphic. So we have a depiction of someone fighting with their rosy boxing gloves on the left, and on the right we have someone enthusiastically running and sweating away in flight mode, and then in the middle we have this slightly curious figure, paralyzed with uncertainty, powerless and avoidance in that kind of frozen state or freeze. So I just want to start by just unpacking a bit the fight or flight. So we have this shift autonomically outside of conscious awareness in response to threat into fight or flight. So this rapidly releases energy into our system. The heart rate goes up, and the degree of this mobilization or this response is in proportion to the threat. So if it's genuinely life-threatening, it's likely to be ramping up to an extreme. And if it's perceived as more mild, just say like some harsh words from your boss or manager, it might be at the more mild end. So this ramping up happens in different levels. Hormonally, there'd like to be a release of cortisol and adrenaline to facilitate the extra energy. The pupils are likely to dilate, the sweat glands become active, blood it becomes focused more than normal towards the arms and the legs. And there's a increase in the system, or our being becomes more vigilant, even hyper vigilant. So it's likely the eyes may start darting around, looking for what is dangerous or what could possibly be dangerous. So there's a survival advantage in terms of thinking the worst. So this is very linked with people who can have catastrophic thinking or continually kind of negative thoughts. That in a stressful situation, that can actually, in a life-threatening situation, that can actually be an advantage. You know, if you're going through a jungle at night, and the system is interpreting a particular sound as possibly a tiger, say example, then that interpretation is likely to help the survival response. And all kinds of other changes like the digestion, energy goes away from digestion because it's not important, and so on. So that list kind of just carries on, but I think it illustrates the degree to which the physiology of the body shifts. And of course, our brains, for our thinking and our emotions, they live in this body of physiology. So they're likely to, certain emotions and thoughts are likely to become more likely, and other emotions of thought are likely to become less likely. So I just wanted to touch on that a bit. So with this, what's sometimes called sympathetic arousal to fight and flight, it's much more likely that we will be restless and anxious. So if, for example, you know, just kind of being fidgety with our bodies, finding it hard to kind of rest. Emotionally, we're likely to be kind of worried, thinking about what could go wrong. Because fight and flight need to happen quickly, it's likely that our thoughts become more racy as well as the system generally speeds up. Another dimension of the flight physiology, it can go into, and this is the more flight side of it, into wanting to be elsewhere. So in some ways, the body is being conditioned to want to be elsewhere. And this can really influence our thoughts. So, and you might be familiar with this, that if you become, you might become like much more prone to imagining particular sense desires, imagining fantasies, things that aren't in your current experience. So wanting what isn't there, or a kind of form of craving, a core form of craving. With this physiology as well, if it goes more towards the fight end, it may be that you are more likely to experience ill will, that the system is kind of going in that direction. So that might be you just start to become more irritable, you even become aggressive. And so already you can start to see, and you probably see how I'm framing this. I'm framing it in terms of the classic 5 hindrances that cloud the mind in Buddhism. So we've got a much more increased likelihood of restless anxiety, of compulsive or neurotic sense desire, or wanting to get away from current experience, and ill will. And I can also add a 4th one here, is doubt and indecision. as a hindrance, because if the system is being geared up and orientated towards flight and fight, it's much less likely to want to engage with practices of kindness and awareness. It's like the physiology has taken us away from that. So we may struggle with this physiology, with engagement and commitment to practice. So that's one broad direction fight and flight can go in. And then we have this figure, this figure in the middle who's frozen in freeze. So this is another dimension of the threat system. When this end of the nervous system is stimulated, the system decides to go towards freeze. Again, big changes in the physiology of the body. So it's likely that the normal body sensations that we may feel start to get numbed. So we get numb to pain in particular to help deal with any overwhelm or pain, either arising internally or from an external threat like being bitten or so on. The energy is likely to be conserved, or our posture is likely to get more immobile, so very different from the restlessness and anxiety. That parts of the brain start to go offline, so the prefrontal cortex isn't particularly needed here. So we struggle to think or remember. Memory is lost. We may have a feeling at the more extreme ends of just feeling dead and lifeless. And again, this physiology doesn't happen and not have knock-on effects for emotionally. So the emotions associated with this are feelings of like shame, despair, hopelessness, and depression. So turning again to the hindrances, it may be not a big jump to imagine that this is linked with sloth and torpor, you know, dullness of the mind, dullness of the body. And again, if there is that, then it's likely as well to be conducive to the hindrance of doubt and indecision. It's unlikely to be the interest and curiosity to engage with the practice, a bit of lack of motivation, and so on. So we have those two or three main responses to threat there that I've very, very briefly just skimmed over. And these responses are wired into all of us, and at any point of the day we're likely to be somewhere on that spectrum. Some of us might be more wired towards the higher energy fight and flight, and some of us might be more wired towards the extreme energy conservation survival mode of that sort of more parasympathetic shutdown. So just a reminder that these fluctuations aren't in our conscious control. So just want to keep reminding us of that. And the system is very helpful, and we want it to be accessible because of its use in resourcing us in life-threatening situations, or challenges. So if I'm, walking in the park at night and then suddenly there's a rustle in the bushes and someone runs at me, it might make the difference between life or death, depending on what the system decides is the best option there, autonomically, to very quickly have access to large amounts of energy, and for my muscles to either fight or run quickly and powerfully. But the problem with this system is that it's quite it's primitive and it's clunky. So the neuroception can easily react to situations, and it can also under react to situations. And these responses of fight, flight, and freeze, they can get stuck. So we can mobilize into the fight physiology or the flight physiology or the freeze physiology. And then even if the threat is judged to have passed, the system can struggle to return to that more resting state, even if the environment around us objectively is just very safe. You know, so it gets stuck. And I'm sure many of you might have experienced that, you know, where you know, you hear something that or you see something that makes, or you feel something that, you know, gives a sense of threat and anxiety, and then even when that has passed, the system can take time to settle down. I was recently, well, a few months ago actually, I was on retreat, and the fire alarm went off just in the middle of the night, and we all kind of, you know, gathered outside the retreat centre, and it took some time to sort of, you know, have the building checked before we could go back in again. But a number of people said that they couldn't get back to sleep afterwards, you know, that they'd immediately kind of woken up with a sense of alarm and adrenaline and concern. And then even when the situation objectively was safe again and people were back in their beds and there was no fire, the system struggled to kind of find its way down again. So what I wanted to move on to really is that, well, given we have this architecture in our body and it does its own thing, you know, what does that mean in terms of our dharmic practice? So I'm just going to take this slide away. Good. Okay. So hopefully you can see me again now. So yeah, I mean, I just wonder, you know, in your own lives, do you recognise these kinds of shifts of being in a way that can happen? And so maybe that's something, you know, you might be interested in bringing more attention to, you know, the kinds of symptoms of the different levels that I've mentioned. Well, one thing that they all three have in common in a way is that they're all contracted and uncomfortable states, the fight, flight and freeze, that they involve a kind of contraction and a shutting down and a disconnection of the fullness of our being. So how do we respond to ourselves when we're in these more contracted states? And I guess, you know, we will all have our own different ways of responding. Some of them we may be more aware of than others. Some of them might be helpful and some of them might be unhelpful. So I just wanted to start by going through some common unhelpful responses that we can have. And I'm going to structure this, it's going to be brief, you know, just to kind of stimulate some ideas around the three poisons in Buddhism. So from a Buddhist point of view, unless we are awakened, enlightened, that there will to some extent be the forces of greed, hatred and delusion through spiritual ignorance affecting the way we relate to experience. So starting with greed. So I mean, a very common greed response to this kind of contraction of being is to try and overlay the discomfort with pleasant sensations. So that might be we kind of reach for the cookie jar, that we are quite compulsive about watching telly to try and create some different sensations that we like more than the unpleasant sensations in our body. It might be that you know, we take drugs of some kind to just kind of, or we get compulsive about exercising, which is quite a common one. You know, another thing that exercise does is it really changes the physiology of the body. We get flushed with endorphins. The shortcoming of it, I think, is that it doesn't deal with the underlying issues that might be driving the discomfort. So, you know, exercise is healthy, but I think compulsive exercise can be a way of avoiding being with ourselves and getting more aware of what's actually going on and driving this discomfort. So they're kind of quite, again, they're quite sort of flighty, you know, they're like bringing in different senses to take me away from where I am. And then the hatred poison, again, linked with fighting. So a common thing is that we experience these contracted states, and then you know, we blame ourselves. We actually attack ourselves. You know, I hate the fact I'm so sluggish and apathetic. I'm sick of this tightness around my throat, you know, and I want to rip it out of me. You know, oh, I'm a failure. You know, I'm failing. You know, my perspective is really kind of like narrow, and I don't feel good in myself. You know, who could possibly love me? You know, there's these kind of that hatred gets directed towards the self, and we might even use the language and the symbolism of Buddhism, you know, to beat ourselves up as well. You know, we might say, you know, I'm so far away from being a bodhisattva. There's no point in me in trying, and things like that. Or the this response of hatred might get kind of more directed, you know, externally. So we might scapegoat others for the fact that, for example, we're feeling irritable and aggressive. You know, they made me feel like this. You know, I'm going to teach that fellow a lesson, sort of once and for all. So that's the kind of, you know, realm of responding with hatred, you know. And then the final one, greed, hatred, is delusion. So this, again, can come in many forms. One can be just holding on an idealized view of self, you know, pretending maybe to yourself and to others that I'm fine, you know, I'm happy. I'm things are going well for me. You know, so we just kind of disconnect from what's actually going on, and we just take on the mask. You know, or it could just be like we just disconnect in another way. We just kind of have which is related up just a sort of stiff upper lip. You know. So again, greed, hatred, and delusion, you know, we all have our own forms of them. Now, from a nervous system point of view, although these might be common ways of responding to contraction and limitation in the body, critically, they don't tend to reach the reptilian brain and imbibe that part of us with a sense of safety that will help us come out of the fight, flight, and freeze. In fact, they tend to do the opposite. They tend to actually create conditions where they sustain the sense of threat. So if we attack ourselves, the threat system takes that as a threat. So it's likely to deepen or at least sustain the fight, flight, and freeze physiology that we might be struggling with. And if we disconnect from the body, you know, particularly with the, you know, what I was just talking about in terms of the delusion response, the system doesn't feel listened to. It doesn't feel attuned to. And so again, that tends to create a sense of a lack of safety. So there's some unhelpful responses. What I'd like to do next is, just as we come really to the end of this overview, is to just mention that from a Buddhist point of view, my sense is a natural starting point for this would be to practice the first foundation of mindfulness, which is just to be aware of our body, you know, the sensations in the body. Because if we're aware of the body, we're likely, that will give a level of attunement, and it will help us become aware of where our system is in terms of these different levels that I'm talking about. So it's a really, you know, this gives a whole, you know, this gives for me another strong justification about the value and power of being aware of the body. Because from a nervous system point of view, that tends to, that attunement, that listening tends to make the system feel a little bit safer. Sometimes when we're aware of the body, it's just like so unpleasant and a bit scary that we need to actually like not give too much attention to it. So, you know, as with a lot of things here, then the response can be nuanced. But generally, if we can, being connected with the body is a basic core Buddhist skill, and it makes so much sense in terms of nervous system health and well-being. And then, of course, you know, the Buddhist system has given us so many tools to work with the poisons, you know, with greed, hatred, and delusion. So we have that huge toolkit to work with here. So we're all different, and we all respond in different ways. So as ever with Buddhist practice, it's you know, it's a process of experimentation, trying things out and seeing what works with us. What is it, you know, in terms of the theme from tonight, that helps us move towards abiding, deepen into that regulated nervous state, you know, when there isn't a threat, when there isn't an objective threat.